everybody, to this episode of The Monthly Blend, a monthly video podcast brought to you by Next, powered by Shulman Rogers, and the Big Idea Connectpreneur community. I'm Tian Wong, founder and host of the Big Idea Connectpreneur community, which is a global community of over 25,000 investors, founders, and business leaders around the world. I'm also the CEO of Opus 8, which helps companies and alternative investment managers raise money through our network of over 3,000 accredited private investors, angels, and family offices throughout the United States. Along with my co-host, Anthony Millen, who's the founder and chair of Next, powered by Shulman Rogers, we are pleased to bring you this monthly video podcast, which covers trends, information, and interesting research and tidbits, as well as fascinating interviews with game changers and newsmakers here in the Washington, D.C., Baltimore Metroplex. Anthony and I started this podcast as a way to increase awareness of cool, innovative happenings in our region, to break down silos, and also to serve as a mechanism to do our part in helping to bring the region together and to help foster innovation and entrepreneurship here. Today, we're absolutely thrilled to have a conversation with two pillars of the Baltimore DMV technology media community. We have Sara Gilgore, who's a staff reporter for the Washington Business Journal and DC Inno, as well as Christopher Wink, who is the publisher and CEO of Technically Media. Christopher is also a limited partner in early stage investment fund Rare Breed Ventures. I'd love to give Sara and Christopher the opportunity to self-introduce themselves a little more fully. Why don't we start with Sara? Sara, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Tian. It's great to be here. My name is Sara Gilgore. I am a reporter at the Washington Business Journal. I've been there about 7 years, and I cover the innovation beat, which includes, it's a lot. So it includes healthcare, biotech and life sciences, startups. And I'm also the editor, as Tian said, of DC Inno, which is our kind of early stage tech-focused sister publication. So we have a newsletter and a website, and kind of through both of those things, I've been able to follow this region's innovation community. So it's great to be here.
Great. Thank you so much, Sara. And Christopher, why don't you say a few words about yourself and Technically?
I mean, in truth, I was trying to decide if I'm more newsmaker, change maker, or pillar. There's a lot of terms being tossed out there. So I'm trying to decide. She's so graciously introduced, co-founder and CEO of Technically, news organization with a community of tech professionals. I'm a journalist by training. So when I started 12 years ago, I just was a very lost and unemployed young journalist. And so it's been quite a journey since. Happy to be here. I've done a little bit of investing. I'm a news organization, so there's limits on both ethics and financial constraints, but that's been interesting. I like whiskey and bicycle riding too.
Oh, that's great. You have a 2-year-old and one on the way.
That's true. I got a couple of kids, 1.5 kid. We're about 1.5 on the way.
And Sara has a beautiful, is that a golden retriever?
She's a sheepadoodle. My dog is sleeping in the background,
Correct.
But she is part Old English sheepdog and part poodle. So she's basically a poodle that's like goofier than normal, which is fun.
Sorry, that dog hasn't moved, so we haven't confirmed that it's not a plant. Is that a real dog? That's not a.
She is snoring quietly in the background,
right,
so we'll see if it gets louder.
All right, deal.
Awesome. Well, hopefully we won't put the dog to sleep. But I'd like to now turn things over to my co-host, Anthony Millen. Anthony is a serial entrepreneur. He's a venture capitalist with a national VC fund. He's also one of the nation's leading startup alternatives. Anthony is founder and chair of Next, powered by Shulman Rogers, which is disrupting the way legal services are being delivered via a unique fixed price structure that allows for expert advice at a price that startups can manage. And also congrats, Anthony, you and your team. Next was recently selected by Legal Week as the startup law firm of the year, beating out several big, well-known brands. So anyway, I'll turn over to Anthony.
Great. Thank you, Tian. And thank you so much, Christopher and Sara, for joining us today. Where I'd like to start today is you've both seen and covered the DC startup ecosystem, and I'd be very interested for you to share your perspectives in terms of how you've seen it evolve and grow in the years leading up to COVID, and then what you've seen kind of since COVID and the impact that has had on the ecosystem. And maybe, Sara, we can start with you.
Yeah, happy to. I think a lot has changed because of COVID, and also, as you said, just because of the evolution of the ecosystem. When I think about the pandemic and what was happening early in 2020, there was a lot of kind of pressure on entrepreneurs to like sink or swim. They basically had to pivot. I feel like every day I was writing a story about a new kind of way that a company was adapting or trying to figure out how to survive in that very uncertain landscape. And I think some struggled, but we also saw that some companies really, moved fast, and since then have taken lessons learned to move forward. So that's been fun to watch. There were also, the companies that had to put off funding raises and they failed to execute plans and had to lay people off. So we saw kind of both sides of that. Mm-hmm. I think something that came out of it and was also happening, but I think it has sped up because of COVID, is we're seeing a lot more social impact ventures kind of emerge and grow in the DC area. And social entrepreneurship, I started here in 2015. That was not a word that people knew. I had to define it in my copy if I was writing about it. But now when you have a company that's tied to a mission, it seems that investors are starting to understand more that it can be a good investment, and there is this appetite to support those ventures. So that's been, I think, one interesting progression too throughout this period.
It has been very exciting to see the growth of social impact oriented companies and investors who have been in both this area and investing from outside this area into DC area startups. So that's really great. Thank you. Christopher, what have you seen in terms of how, since you started following this ecosystem, you've seen it grow and evolve, and what changes have you seen kind of as a result of COVID?
Yeah, I think looking back at the end of 2019, DC, DMV writ large, I mean, it sits at that top tier of a second tier of innovation economies. It has like of that second tier, sub Valley, New York and Boston, it is among the tops in financing, in density. This is a really socioeconomically diverse region. It's a really educated region. It was doing a tricky dance of transferring from really established professional services, its classic reputation as a government hub, and trying to add diversity to its economic mix. And I think if we were sitting here at the end of 2019 having a conversation, we'd say prospects look really strong for doing just that. I don't think anywhere in the world has a good handle on what the future looks like exactly. I think it still feels really disrupted. Obviously, financial markets continue to be roiled as we sit right here, and how a relatively high cost of living for this region will play out for retaining talent, I think is still being sorted out. I don't think we have that answer yet. So I think those are things that I hope we get into. But the DMV story is, it is the most educated and socially economic diverse region in the country that is at that precipice of top of the second tier. Can it join the top tier? I think that is the big story that we would have had in 2019 and we're picking up now.
In terms of, the strengths that you just talked about, the diversity in terms of just the educated workforce that we have, as you look around and what you've seen from your viewpoint of looking at the ecosystem, what do you see as, in addition to those two, as some of the other strengths that kind of identify or could be used to describe our ecosystem? And what do you see are some of our bigger weaknesses or challenges when you've looked at us relative to some of these other ecosystems that you refer to, maybe that, you are top, what you could considering to be kind of top tier startup areas?
We technically report daily in a handful of markets, and I've been blessed to do some reporting in others. And I'm sure we all have this experience that I secretly think every city, every region's greatest strength is also its weakness repackaged, depending on how you frame it or talk about it. And so in this region, we've been reporting since 2015, I think. So six, so whatever that is, 7 or 8 years. This relationship to is the density of federal government and government IT, is that a stranglehold that tech workers get locked in and never come out? or is it a blessing that there's this huge density of technical talent and brain power? And I think the answer is it's both, right? Like it is both a challenge and an opportunity. I think right now, a story that I'm super interested in seeing how it plays out. Unlike a lot of regions, this region has a particularly high rate of residency requirements. Those anecdotal stories of the founder who's here because their partner works at XYZ government entity or XYZ NGO, and they are here because they're bound to be here by their partner's career. That founder story or that tech worker story, something that a lot of other regions don't have. And as things play out, not that we ever want someone here to be required to grow a company here, I think that lets this region weather a real challenging time for cities in a way that maybe other cities won't. So I think strength is the density of brain power that is here and isn't going anywhere, is undeniably and powerful. Maybe a weakness, I would love to hear what Sara has to say too here. But a weakness, this region will always be encumbered by being relatively expensive. And we are having a housing affordability conversation nationally. That is a national conversation that is everywhere. And it's, of course, made more heightened here. So what kinds of founders or what kinds of tech workers can thrive here, I think is something that this region really has to grapple with. But there's strengths. We technically did a series called Who Makes 200K, and we just looked at a bunch of regions and compared by industry type and race and gender demographic, how and where are people doing well. This region has relatively strong socioeconomic diversity. Tech has grown to a relatively small sliver of our high income earners. So those are that's not going to change. But who can join the party is a big challenge for this region to take on.
Sara, what are some of the things you're seeing in terms of our strengths and weaknesses that you've kind of seen over time?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Christopher for sure on cost of living. We know it is not cheap to live here. And especially now with, you have the pandemic era shift to remote work. People want to live where they want to live. And that doesn't necessarily help draw people here or keep people here, especially if they can get a job where they're still able to be based where they want, and maybe they can make the salary from their market or something like that. So I think that's a challenge, especially as employers now think about, and startups think about, right? Like, what are their policies going to be with where do their employees need to live? I do think that a strength, and Christopher, you touched on this too, just in terms of our proximity to the nation's capital, that is 100% a built-in asset that benefits companies across industries, regardless of, it is not just a government town. We know that because we write about those other players every day, but even just in like healthcare land, where I tend to spend a lot of my time because that's a big part of my beat. We have the NIH, we have the FDA. We're seeing biotech and life sciences companies off of the momentum of COVID vaccine work coming here, locating here. You have the Johnson & Johnson J-Labs incubator at the new Children's National Innovation Campus, drawing new startups or startups from other markets that maybe now are setting up their headquarters here. So you have Amazon and things like that. So I think in general, just it being Washington, D.C. is a huge strength, even though as a result, there are also some negatives there too.
You've both touched on the cost of living and its impact on talent. We all know that to really grow and evolve the startup ecosystem, finding the right talent and attracting the right talent to companies is going to be really key. What, in addition to the cost of living, what have you seen or written about or thought about in terms of the talent side of the equation in this area? And do you see with some of these big companies that are moving in, like an Amazon or some of the examples that you've given, that's going to kind of bring more people into the area, or that would be available to the startup ecosystem? Or is that something that becomes more of a challenge to the startup ecosystem?
I think I'm hesitating a lot in interviews and conversations of late to make like a hard stance on how I think this plays out. I mean, a few things that feel certain. We know that remote work has accelerated. We also know that the majority of employers are still appear to be requiring some in-office time. So it feels like we're going to have still orbits of employment. That seems like that's not going to magically go away. But we're going to have this growing constellation of those who can work remotely. And you'd expect in some lower cost, desirable places to live, cost of living tweaks up. And does that cap growth in places that are relatively expensive? Do we kind of self-select our way out for regions? DC of a dozen cities we looked at in that analysis I alluded to earlier, who makes 200K, no surprise, DC was in the top tier of the percentage of its population that was earning more than 200K. When you account for cost of living, it actually falls to the middle a little bit lower. It's like the high salaries relatively are reflected because of its relatively high cost of living. So I think broadly, economic development strategies are already having to adapt to prioritize people over companies. This was something we were already talking about before the pandemic with the rise of software and knowledge-based companies, that it might be increasingly illogical to pursue a company because it's less sticky, right? Like if your 80s econ dev strategy was get the warehouse to move here, get the factory to move here, it makes sense, right? Like you subsidize that movement, it's kind of hard to move it. You've already had that infrastructure. Some of the shared cost made sense. We are all investing in infrastructure we'll all benefit from. Subsidizing a bunch of people to come work on laptops makes a lot less sense because it's super flighty. And that's like a really just giving privileged workers tax law. It doesn't make a ton of sense. So econ dev strategies are radically being rethought. And I think for the good reason to focus on where do people want to live? I think maybe the simplest thing is the right one, that an economic development strategy is create a great place to live, because when people live there, they'll do work together. That happens. So I know that may sound overly boring, but I think I've had my fair share of conversations with policymakers who want this, like, what tiny tweak to the tax code can I do to get all of the startups to come here? And you're like, man, like, where do people want to live? And that is so much about the economic future of how our regions will thrive. I think this region is really strong at that, but will we be able to keep adding new kinds of people? That I think we'll keep coming back to an affordability question. So make a city a great place to live is my best advice.
Sara, in terms of the other side, we spoke about the talent side. In terms of a lot of the guests that we had over the course of the year, we're also talking about capital and the kind of the role capital will play and has played and is evolving in the region. And I'd be interested just in terms of kind of what you've seen or read or written about or thought about in terms of kind of the changes in the role of capital and how you see that might evolve as well.
Yeah, we could probably talk about this for a while. I mean, I think the biggest thing that kind of comes to my mind through the pandemic, fundraising for companies exploded, right? We saw companies that used to raise like a $5 million, $10 million round were raising 25, 30 million. And I feel like there was a period where $100 million in a funding round for a startup was a normal, very common story, right? And that has changed. It's slowed a little bit. I think same with companies going public. There was this great momentum and a lot has obviously affected that. But to your point, and to what Christopher was saying too, I think that can sort of affect the talent pool here when you look at these companies that now have the funding, have the capital to go on a hiring spree, to add 50, 100 positions when maybe they had fewer than that to begin with. They're more than doubling their headcounts. And all of a sudden, you have a workforce here that was not the size of what it was previously. So that's kind of one trend that I'm following along with all of these other things. I think it's definitely affecting what we're seeing here, but also there are all these other dynamics. So I'm not confident pointing to this or that as the cause. I think it's going to evolve, but it'll be interesting to watch kind of how that plays out.
The last thing I wanted to just touch on before we end this segment is again, we've spoken to a lot of people over the course of the year and we talk about the importance of attracting capital and attracting talent and awareness of what's going on in DC. How do you see kind of the roles that you're playing in the media side or the press side, in terms of the story, telling the story of the DC startup ecosystem? And, what are other ways that other people in different parts of the ecosystem can help get the word out about some of these changes? You talked about how this is not just kind of a government town, or there's a lot happening, and there are a lot of amazing things about the people who make up our ecosystem. So what are some guidance that you guys could give to ways to really educate other parts of the country as to the exciting and dynamic things that are happening here?
I mean, I think it always helps to remember that no one cares about us as much as we care about us. And every city and region in the world at this point wants to understand, why don't people care more about, the Bengali tech ecosystem? How much are you paying attention to the Sao Paulo tech ecosystem? Like, the answer is this is such a globally competitive landscape that no one cares about your stupid tech ecosystem, because everyone has one. But that, in some sense, I think can be really freeing, because then what you have to do is you have to go do the work, and stories follow. Yes, I am very self-interested, but I think that the work that Sara and my coworker Michaela and our respective news organizations, I believe that it's important. I think we all know people's opinions of us as individuals don't only come from their experiences with us, they come from what other people say about us. How do people talk about us as individuals? It's the same for cities, it's the same for companies. How do people talk about this? Humans don't operate on data. We operate on feelings that are created by stories, and then we later find data to prove our feelings correct, whatever those feelings are. So journalism is this act of trying to collect stories. There's the idea that media is a mirror, but it's always a little bit skewed, which is why media gets rightly criticized about, what are we doing on representation? What are we doing? What narrative are we pursuing? And that push is usually someone saying, we want you to be a little bit better, or a little bit more critical, or a little bit more pointed than the purest form of reality to help us get somewhere. That I think we all, I'm sure Sara will say, take a lot of responsibility in that. I know Sara has this experience because we've sure had it 15 years. Tech press is constantly criticized for being too glowing and too critical. Hey, how dare you challenge that first-time founder so much? They're figuring it out. But we also get the, how dare you not challenge that business leader even more? And I think that's a tension that in business press, I think business press tends to do a better job than a lot. I think business press, we do a decent job of trying to push on numbers and analytics, trying to push on progress, trying to push on solutions. But also we do have some optimism in a lot of what we cover. We do, on the whole, want these regions to be more economically successful, more economically inclusive, and that comes out in our editorial work. So I think each company has to say who is telling the story of what we do, and I think we as regions have to do something similar. But no one cares about us naturally.
No, that's great insight, Sara.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, obviously I have a lot of the same thoughts. I think the media, first of all, needs to bring attention to what, whoever your readers are, what they need to know. But it is probably even more important to be talking about, the challenges, the bad stuff. It is not all just profiling a cool company and saying, this is really interesting, you should know about this. It's all of the things that are hard and what are the dynamics driving those things. So locally, there is a big gap in access to capital, but that is not unique to our region. It is 100% a much bigger problem than just Greater Washington. But when you have, women, people of color, other underrepresented founders getting a sliver of the funding from investors, we're also seeing efforts to close that gap in this region. So you have nonprofits, you have accelerators, you have other efforts to kind of funnel that money in other ways to those entrepreneurs. So I think it's our job to be looking at like what is driving the problem, and on the other side, what are kind of what's in the works to change things and to fix things. And I think if you do both of those things, then hopefully, you can do a good job.
Great. And I think that leads into some of the discussion that Tien will be focusing on in the next segment. And with that, Tien, I hand it off to you.
Terrific. Thank you guys so much. Picking up on the whole media thing, we live in a divided society. I know I'm talking about mainstream, quote unquote, MSM, mainstream media, but you guys are in the business media, and which is, I guess, part of the mainstream media.
I just start getting, Tien, I get night sweats when someone said mainstream media now. It just tweaks me out whenever anyone says that. Just as a warning. That's why my body's just
mainstream
convulsing.
Concocted term too by the mainstream media.
That's freaking me out.
Yeah, no, I don't blame you. I mean, you guys are doing, I mean, from our perspective, you're reporting on super exciting, positive optimism, entrepreneurs. But, are you guys, what kind of difficulties are you guys facing as media in today's society? And, what do you feel are your greatest challenges, and how do you think they'll be solved, and will they be solved anytime soon?
Yeah, I mean, Sara alluded to investment being at its own conversation. This is like, I'm going to have to like strap myself to the desk and not go off the rails in this topic. This might be, I'm going to take a deep breath. This is its own conversation. There's a lot, right? Like, I'm a nerd about the collapse of local news in particular, being a corrosive and still undertold story of how we as a country are really struggling to get work done, because when we nationalize everything, we lose all local variety that we were once able to have. We have considerably more political variation in local news traditionally than we would in national news. So it was a place where we were able to have, states as experiments and labs in a way that we are losing right now with a very national conversation. And I would bet Sarah's getting some of this experience, but actually, let me say this. I'm unhealthily obsessed with Pew Research's annual trust index. They do an annual trust index of how a survey of a few thousand Americans vote, or I should say in a survey, how they rank their level of trust in different institutions. And we are in a couple decades long slide, and that's been happening. And across the board, law enforcement, universities, doctors, scientists, journalists, all of the job titles that a 2-year-old actually knows or 5-year-old actually knows have all been losing trust, public confidence for many years. Surprise, the pandemic was real bad for all of us, anyone in any of those jobs, and especially bad for journalists. If you thought in 2018 we were in a bad shape, because we were, still a majority of Americans said they had some degree of confidence in journalists. And the last 2 years, we had the worst 2-year decline that we've had in a couple decades of Pew doing this survey. And so now a majority of Americans have no confidence in journalists, which is a super terrifying and I think frustrating thing. And I think a lot of people in journalism have a lot of responsibility, for the record, in why we're in that place. And I think that's really challenging for telling an economic story, to get me back on message and get me off my very excitable nature. It loses our chance to do what Sara alluded to, of actually challenge those, because that's what it's supposed to look like. We're supposed to be someone who's essentially over time challenging the assumptions of how are we getting better as a region, where are we going as a region. It's someone's meant to say this is what's working and this is what's not. And I think we're going to lose that, and we have lost that. Sara, I think you should step in here and stop me from ranting, because I'm very worked up already.
I get it.
Step in and help
understand.
Me. Help me, Sara.
I mean, I think if there's one thing, it's like, as you said, we have a responsibility as the media. We need to get things right. we need to earn and I guess re-earn the public's trust. We need to establish ourselves as the authorities on this stuff that we are covering. And I think just now more than ever, getting it right is so important. And, that's how slowly maybe you start to build that up. And I think you touched on this too. It's not our job to be cheerleaders for what we are writing about and only talk about what's positive. We need to be covering it all and doing it objectively and fairly. And that I think that hasn't changed ever, but now that is more important than ever because of what you were saying about, the landscape and what has happened over the past few years.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of challenges being faced, and I appreciate your guys' thoughts on that. Sara, you talked a little bit about ESG earlier, environmental, social, and corporate governance, and it is obviously becoming mainstream in the business world, hopefully soon. But how do you guys see ESG, the focus on diversity and inclusion and ESG showing up in our region, both on a general basis as well as in the startup ecosystem? And one thought, Sara, you had mentioned that some of these micro VC funds, some of these institutions that are really focused on it, we have incubators and accelerators. How do you think they're going to fare down the road from a performance standpoint? I know there's a lot in that.
Yeah, I'm just thinking how I want to dive in there. I mean, I think first of all, generally in the business community, we can probably all agree. I mean, I think businesses are just more aware now that DEI and ESG just must be a priority and has to be a priority. And I think we're seeing that a lot in recruitment and kind of, where organizations look to recruit, looking for more diverse talent pools and maybe areas where they didn't before think about, I could be, showing that this is an opportunity to this group of people or to this group of people. And I think that's one kind of way we're seeing it. In terms of the other part of your question, how this will go on the funding side of things, we've definitely seen, I think, increasingly over recent years, more efforts to provide funding and get funding to earlier stage companies, because there is this gap where you've got companies that maybe, or founders that can't raise a friend and family around, don't have access. And, it's hard to get to that next Series A stage. And you have this kind of empty period where, if you're not raising money, you can't grow. And so we've got players in this area that are trying to bring those opportunities about. So first thing that comes to mind, I wrote about earlier this week, Halcyon in Georgetown. It's a nonprofit. They have an incubator. They have created, I think, 3 funding vehicles at this point in the past few years to start to create other ways that companies could raise money. So they have an angel group that just made some investments. Again, they raised their first fund. They have a microloan fund. So there are things like that. There's Black Girl Ventures comes to mind, Street Entrepreneurs, which is really good about kind of showing founders other options, as we talked about before, to funding that maybe they weren't aware was an option. If they only thought they had to raise a round, that's not always the only option. As to how they'll fare, I think there's a lot of challenges, but also there is no shortage of demand for this stuff. And I think more than ever, at least from where I sit, and Christopher, tell me what you're seeing, but there are definitely more companies that are interested in other ways to kind of grow their businesses in the early stages other than just giving away equity. And that, I think, bodes well in that sense.
Yeah, this feels like another one of these questions. There's like 40 interesting conversations inside of this. We technically did some of that reporting as a lot of folks did. 2020 was 50 years after Milton Friedman's shareholder value essay. This kind of like fair or not kind of gets marked as the ushering in of maximizing profit as a high level priority. And it's like a really genuinely important societal conversation for us to have. And it felt eerily timed to land in a pandemic after the high profile murder of George Floyd, amid economic and social collapse. Like, it was the right or the most challenging or both time to say, what do we think the responsibility of private and public, but corporations should have in our lives? And And it's messier than any of us want to believe. And there's lots of criticisms of ESG funds because some of them are frankly just marketing, right? Like there's been a handful of really high profile national stories of just like someone just calls it a green index fund and to try to chase dollars, but it doesn't really mean anything. So we don't have a lot of rigor about what some of this means. But as you guys might push back on me, many people are putting the work into defining what this can mean. It seems clear that like climate change and race-based predictors of economic success are so abhorrent that they need to exist everywhere. I think that is a place that I'm willing to just fight that these are just too existential, they're too core, and we can't evade them. I think we end up in an interesting place later to say, well, how many other topics do we want to say we do think companies should have to confront? What is a company's stance supposed to be on the war in Ukraine? Are you supposed to have a stance as a company? That became a really interesting conversation. It's really messy. I think Sara alluded to, for me right now in our reporting, what I think the clearest viewpoint for me is it becomes a business problem when it's a talent problem. That right now, for lots of reasons, particularly in and around hiring technical workers, but not exclusively, we are in a labor-powered market. And so if the majority of tech workers say that they want their company to take a firm stance around diversifying their workforce, which they do, then that's a reality of, do you want to have access to the most competitive talent? Then it became a business priority. But I think company leaders and companies themselves are going to do a dance here of what issues have to be a business priority as opposed to or in complement to them as individuals. And I think the ESG narrative will blow up in early stage investing, and obviously is also showing up in public markets.
Thank you for your thoughtful remarks, guys. We're almost out of time. I have one final question, and then and we can close out. But we're halfway done with 2022. You guys are on the front lines. You're writing great stories. Sara, I loved your story about Seth Goldman, who's a good friend of mine, and he's coming back. And what do you guys see as, what do you predict will be the leading story in technology and innovation in the region for the second half of this year?
Well, one cheap, quick answer is that always the answer to that question is something that no one saw coming, right? That is, so I think my initial answer is, barring the thing that none of us saw coming, which tends to dominate news cycles when something just explosive happens, we will be watching really closely movements of people. And I think a story around, do business and corporations keep their heightened rate like they are right now? Does the trend of Black Americans outpacing white Americans in business and corporation, which hasn't happened in my understanding in ever tracking it, but has happened the last several quarters, does that continue and we make ground? And are the people doing those and otherwise working, are they net leaving or net gaining in this DMV region? And LinkedIn increasingly does now. There's regular data. There's some other data sources that we look at. Whether people are coming or going after this pandemic, I think is a bet that I would make on being an incredibly important story for this region and as the pandemic stretches on. Got it.
Sara, how about you?
Yeah, the Seth Goldman story was fun. Just seeing that he sells Honest Tea years ago, and then Coke years later decides, we're going to drop it. And he's like, I can't let this happen. I'm going to start a new tea brand under my new company. And I think he just real quick to sneak this in, I think he has inspired a lot of entrepreneurs to start companies about, work that they care about. And that if you work hard and you make good business decisions, success can come from that. So it's been fun to follow that story. But I think there's a lot. I mean, it's hard to boil it down to one. I think we have the labor crisis, we have the mental health crisis, we have all of these sort of ripple effects from the pandemic. Not to say the pandemic is still the number one story, but where does it leave us and where do we go from here, which obviously extends across beats, across organizations. I think that is just inevitably, we will have to be following that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. You guys are awesome, by the way. I enjoy reading both of your publications. From a personal standpoint, I want to thank the Business Journal and Technically for the recent kudos. I really personally appreciate that very much. Nice surprises, both of them too, by the way. Thank you guys. But with that, I want to say thank you for joining us. It's really good to see you guys and get some thoughts and some great insights, and turn it back over to Anthony.
I want to thank Sara and Christopher for joining us today and for all of the insightful comments that they shared with us. I also want to thank you both for your leadership in this industry and ecosystem and this area. And we really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you.
Thanks for having us. This was a blast.
Always pleasure to have nerdy conversations on economic trends in and around technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship. What a treat.
This was awesome. Thank you guys so much.